We engaged with 27,000 people. We got over 1 million hits on laptops and almost 500,000 hit on Android or, handheld devices. We really achieved a lot as civil society. And at the same time, most of us are a little bit disappointed with the way member states handle CSW. I do not want to take too much time to talk to you about what our plans are. The one thing I can confirm to you, what we've been saying over and over again, is that CSW 65 or CSW does not end at the end of CSW 65. We're already meeting with groups of people to figure out how we can bring the energy, the collaboration into CSW 66. So keep your eyes open for our MailChimps. While we're letting everybody in, oh my goodness, there are so many people coming in. I also just wanted to tell you that we're going to do a couple of polls. I just feel like I need to figure out who we have in the room. So get ready for a few polls while I'm talking. I see so many familiar faces. Thank you all for being here. Thank you for the support of NGO CSW New York and the forum. And here we go. Thank you, Devin. You all know Devin by now. How amazing was she during the forum? She did such an amazing job. Yay, Devin. With her team, of course. That's our Devin. All right. First time. Quite interesting. So just so that you all know, we did send a reminder. There's a survey for the forum that I really hope that you all take the time to fill it out and encourage your team members and friends to fill it out, because we really want to know what we did wrong, what we did right, so that we can improve on it next year. It does look like no matter what, we're going to have a hybrid forum next year. I don't know exactly what that looks like, just like I didn't know what this forum was going to look like when we decided to go completely virtual. So I'm just as happy and surprised and honored that we pulled it off together, that we really did have an amazing online forum. And I can tell you, with the 27,000 people engaged, we got less than 10 issues, I would say. I mean, obviously there were a lot of technical issues that we all learned together. And one of the things that we're going to do next year, I've been saying this in a lot of meetings, is really encourage people to read instructions better and maybe give them some room to read instructions, like have instructions ready ahead of time, because it was definitely challenging to try to make sure everybody knew what they were doing on the platform. But other than that, I think, as you all know, we're hearing from you all that you all enjoyed it. So thank you. All right, so the only other thing I want to tell you, yes, please fill out the survey. Please look out for some interesting ideas we're coming up with on how, now that we know global gender equality advocates and feminists are ready to be engaged and be part of a movement, we can't lose that momentum. We want to make sure that member states hear from us and know that we are here and we're not going to disappear, even if they don't let us into the room. And as you all know, CSW 66 has working methods on their agenda. So we want to get ready and see how we can improve how CSW works. Like I said, I do not want to take too much time. I also am very pleased that we remembered, even during the chaos of the forum, that we have an election coming up, that my 2 years is up as chair. And I am willing to run again, but of course we have to follow all the bylaws. I'm very pleased to say that we had an amazing nominating committee, and I want to name them, led by Erica Higby. Most of you who have been around with NGO CSW know that she was our treasurer a few executive committees ago. Susan O'Malley, who was past chair, who I'm very grateful for her support and help throughout my tenure, if you want to call it. And of course, we also had Anita Thomas, Jillian D'Souza, and Mary Luke. These 5 were our nominating committees, and they've been working behind the scenes for the last couple of months. And I'm going to give the floor to Erica to announce the slate, and then she'll explain to you what happens, because I'm not supposed to be involved in this. I'm just telling you what we're doing. And then we're going to go right into our program, because Pam, Rosa, and Jordan, our executive committee members, together put together an amazing program today. And I am going to enjoy it like everyone else on this meeting for the next almost 2 hours. Thank you all again for being here. Thank you for your support. And I will see you in the chat. Erica, the floor is yours. And thanks, Kevin, for the polls. Yes, go ahead, Erica.
Thanks, Jorge. Good morning, everyone. I'm going to be nice and brief too. We had as Jorge said, a lovely nominating committee. We worked pretty hard, and we are charged with nominating a slate for the NGO-CSW New York Executive Committee election, which will take place in June of 2021, consisting of 5 officers and 3 elected members at large, which according to the bylaws is to be announced at least 3 weeks prior to the May NGO-CSW New York general meeting. So we are announcing those today to be in compliance with the bylaws. This slate, along with any nominations from the floor that are seconded during the May meeting, will go on the ballot for the election. The election will take place during the June general meeting. So we're announcing them today. The next meeting, nominations can come from the floor, and then the following meeting, the election will actually take place. The May and June meetings will be virtual. They are scheduled to take place on May 20th from 1 to 3 and June 17th from 8:30 to 10:30, and that's Eastern Daylight Time. The election procedures will be announced in May, so we'll give you some clarity on how that will actually take place because it's going to be virtual. So the nominating committee slate for the NGO-CSW New York Executive Committee is as follows. Huri Gedelekian as chair, Ivy Koch as vice chair, Rosa Lazard as treasurer, Ozzy Khalili as communications secretary, Safira Ramshvar as recording secretary, Margarita Jones as elected member at large, Pamela Morgan as elected member at large, and Terry Ince as elected member at large. And that's my announcement for this morning. Thanks.
Thank you, Erica, so much. And of course, we will share that with our minutes, and we'll put that in the chat as well for your attention. And of course, it will be in our newsletter and everything else, because yeah, so you'll have a reference to it. Now, without further ado, I definitely want to give the floor to 3 amazing executive committee members, Pamela, Rosa, and Jordan. The floor is yours to take us on this journey of climate, migration, and gender equality.
Thank you, Jorge. Thank you so much. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, buenos dias, buenas tardes, buenas noches. I'm Rosa Lazardi. I'm going to be starting on behalf of the small group that we have, my wonderful colleagues, Pamela Morgan and Jordan Williams, who helped together. We put this format together that we are presenting to you today. We have a fantastic panel. We have a packed panel, in fact. So I'm gonna quickly just give some top views and then present our panel. Today, we are going to be focusing, as Huri said, on the intersection of climate change, migration, and gender. We focus on this because we know that the climate crisis has been established as one of the root causes of migration. We know that women and girls are the most vulnerable during migration and are the most vulnerable when climate chaos hits, not only because of the structural inequalities that keep them at risk of violence and oppression, but also with other intersecting factors such as poverty, such as racial background. And just to say that these factors will come into the discussion, although they are not in the title. We know that we're living in a world where these intersectionalities cannot be ignored regarding race and poverty and gender identity and caste and countries of origins. So let me just say that I will be introducing our first two panelists and then continue throughout the program. We will have a dynamic duo begin the panel discussion, the panel presentations. I've had the pleasure of knowing these two young women from their start here at the UN. We were office mates. We shared some work around gender and poverty and financing for development. So our first introduction is Cecily Kern. So I want to make sure that Cecily has her camera on, her video on. And again, I want to remind others to please turn your video camera off to maximize the presence of our panel. So Cecily Kern and Teresa Blumenstein. Cecily is the Global Policy and Research Advocate with Mercy International Association. Since 2014, when I met her, she has represented communities of women religious at the UN and engaged in advocacy related to gender equality, human rights, human mobility, poverty eradication, and water and sanitation. Cecily advocated for strong rights-based and gender-responsive human mobility policies in the processes to elaborate the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development, the New York Declaration for Refugees and Migrants, and the Global Compact for Safe, Orderly, and Regular Migration. She currently serves as the Vice Chair of the NGO Committee on Migration. Teresa Blumenstein is the coordinator of Justice Coalition of Religious and the convener of the Climate-Induced Displacement Subcommittee of the NGO Committee on Migration. Teresa has been working in the community of Catholic religious NGOs at the UN since 2015. Following Cecily's shining example, she served first as the Assistant UN Representative of the Loreto community, and then she joined the team of Unanima International, a coalition of congregations of sisters focusing her advocacy in the areas of mining, human rights to water, and migration. While in both of these roles, she helped lead a planning effort that resulted in the launch of the Justice Coalition of Religious, or JCOR. And for the last 3 years, she has been the coordinator of JCOR at the UN. So without further ado, let's have Cecily and Teresa begin the panel presentation. Thank you.
Hi, good morning, afternoon, evening, everyone. Thanks so much for having us here. It's been a while since I've been participating with this committee, but it is one of the places I started at the UN, so glad to be back with you. And Cecily and I, as Rosa said, will have the pleasure of talking about the multi-part intersection of climate, migration, and gender with you this morning. So I just want to begin by giving kind of a big global overview of kind of what is the scale of the issue of climate displacement in general. And so just to give you a sense of some of the big numbers, the global figures for 2019 were that 33.4 million people were internally displaced for any reason. And of those 33.4, 24.9, so just about 3/4 of them were actually displaced by some type of environmental disaster. And those figures, that ratio has become pretty typical of the data collected since 2008, which is really the available data in this area. And since that time, 2008, it has been an aggregate of 288 million people who have been displaced by some form of environmental disaster, whether it be the sudden onset disasters that we hear a lot about, like cyclones and hurricanes, tropical storms, floods, earthquakes, or some of the slower onset ones, like extreme temperatures or droughts. However, as I'll get to later, we have more data on the sudden events, of course, in terms of displacement. And so some of those limitations to the numbers that we have there, as sweeping as those numbers are, they're actually leaving out a lot of people. For example, data for those displaced by drought was really only begun to be collected in 2019, and those numbers are still very underestimated due to the complex nature of kind of discerning the multi-part reasons for which one chooses to migrate. And given that drought comes on slowly, it usually intertwines with a series of other factors that lead someone to decide to migrate, such that collecting data for the reason of migration becomes pretty complex down the road. We also don't have data for other slow onset disasters like sea level rise and soil salination. And very importantly, we don't have global data on those who are displaced across international borders. So all of those numbers that you saw in the previous slide were referring only to those displaced within their own countries. We do not have, except for in ad hoc cases, any records of exactly who's displaced across borders on a global level. And we also do not have global data on those who are displaced due to the environmental degradation that's caused by industrial activities or other types of development projects that can certainly do make land uninhabitable and force people to migrate in pretty large numbers in some cases. And so the reason that this is an important issue for us to be discussing in this group of gender-focused individuals is because of these very huge numbers of people being displaced for environmental reasons. UNDP and the Global Gender Climate Alliance have determined that about 80% of those being displaced by climate change are actually women and girls, which is tremendous overrepresentation. And there are many complex reasons for that, many of which you could all guess at given your previous experience in gender analysis with other issues. And it all comes back to the underlying factors that create situations of vulnerability for women and girls. We have many different types of gender-based discrimination, violence, and inequality that lead to losses and limitations in opportunities and resources that would allow women and girls to either adapt and stay where they are in a safe way, or to make the decision to migrate in a safe way rather than be forced to wait until a disaster strikes and then have to do it suddenly and in the case of crisis. And so as a result, women and girls face increased vulnerability to the impacts of climate change up front, and then also increased vulnerability to violation of their rights once they are in a situation of displacement. And so to speak a bit more about what are those underlying factors that create that vulnerability, there are, of course, economic barriers impeding women's financial inclusion, gainful employment, and economic independence, all of which make housing in lower risk areas and possibilities of evacuation or migration less affordable for them. So they're forced to stay in place longer, even if the circumstances are not healthy or ideal environmentally. Of course, the educational barriers also make it difficult to obtain credentials that would allow women and girls to carry their skills and have them be recognized for the purpose of employment and decent work opportunities if they moved to a new community. They also face legal barriers to land ownership, what would allow them to pursue agriculture in an area other than in their ancestral homeland. And also, of course, laws limiting freedom to move, which would make it more difficult to make arrangements for migration without the permission or accompaniment by a male guardian or spouse. And of course, though this is only a small taste of it, there are also gender role barriers, given that women, of course, women and girls, take on a disproportionate share of caretaking duties for older persons and children who cannot easily or quickly move in situation of the midst of a crisis or in the situation of migration. And of course, another major factor that we have to talk about that impacts women and girls, specifically in cases of disaster and displacement, is increased risk and exposure to gender-based violence. And this we see while they're still in place, particularly in situations of prolonged drought, where collecting water or firewood takes an increasing amount of time, requires covering more distance further from home, and that increases exposure to possible violence. We also have heard many instances of a rise in domestic violence, which occurs when environmental degradation places strains on the family's livelihood. We see physical vulnerability of women and girls to violence and trafficking while they're in transit on a migratory route, and also once they're in a new community and they are more removed from their familiar social networks. And we also see that their lack of autonomy on their home and public settings that they may have been facing to begin with is exacerbated after migrating to a new community where they are increasingly seen as outsiders and will face even greater barriers to justice systems and public support services that would be of help to them, either in preventing or addressing any form of violence against them. And finally, we also have heard many reports of rises in gender-based violence or intimate partner violence in camp or emergency shelter settings following a sudden onset disaster.
So one of the many areas where we have seen trends of growing displacement due to the effects of climate change is Central America, which is one of the most climate vulnerable places on Earth. And in recent years, extended periods of drought have been punctuated by intense storms that decimate crops and create really devastating food insecurity. Just in November 2020, the Northern Triangle of Central America was hit by hurricanes Eta and Iota, which left thousands of people displaced both internally and externally. And situations of violence, including pervasive gender-based violence and economic instability in the Northern Triangle, have been and will continue to be exacerbated by these effects of climate change. Droughts, floods, increasing temperatures, and rising sea levels. And Indigenous people in particular face risks of violence or forced displacement when state or private actors seek to exploit natural resources on their land, and women and girls displaced by storms and other environmental factors are at heightened risk of gender-based violence and often lack access to basic services and economic opportunities, as Teresa mentioned.
And of course, all these phenomena Cecily was describing are not by no means limited to the Northern Triangle and Central America. We can see them in areas of disaster all over the world. And so just to offer a few examples, in the wake of the 2004 Indian Ocean earthquake and the tsunami that followed, there was a notable difference in the casualties that were suffered by men and women in the tsunami affected areas of Indonesia, Sri Lanka, and India. And then the final analysis, it was determined that about 4 times as many women as men were killed by those tsunamis. And there were many factors involved and a lot of analysis and reflection on that. But one of the primary reasons cited that emerged when it was all said and done was that valuable time was lost for women who would have largely been engaged in some type of caretaking activity at the time when that tsunami arrived. And precious seconds that may have been used, were they on their own, to seek shelter or get to higher ground, were spent kind of trying to round up children or other people in their care. And just to offer another example from another corner of the world, in the South Pacific, we saw that new domestic violence cases increased dramatically by about 300% in the wake of the 2 tropical cyclones that hit one of the provinces of Vanuatu in 2011.
So for the rest of our time, we're going to share from our experiences in the international migration policy spaces at the UN, and specifically on the Global Compact for Safe, Orderly, and Regular Migration. The Global Compact for Migration is the first intergovernmentally negotiated agreement prepared at the UN to cover all dimensions of international migration in a holistic and comprehensive way. It's a non-legally binding cooperative framework. But with the GCM, the international community for the first time makes specific commitments not only to address climate change and environmental degradation and disasters as drivers of migration, but also to protect those who are compelled to leave their countries because of these events. And migration is inherently international. It's an issue that individual governments can't address on their own. And at a time when multilateralism was and continues to be challenged, the Global Compact demonstrates the power of compromise, consensus, and collaboration, even on one of the most difficult global challenges. The development of the GCM largely arose from events that happened in 2015 with the adoption of the Sustainable Development Goals, especially SDG 10.7, and the large movements of refugees and migrants around the world. And this led to the negotiation and adoption of the New York Declaration for Refugees and Migrants, which recognized for the first time that there was a need for a comprehensive approach to migration. And as a result, UN member states agreed to cooperate in the elaboration of 2 global compacts, one for migration and one for refugees.
So at the outset of this document, when it was all finished in its long negotiation process, were a set of guiding principles that are meant to be used as kind of cross-cutting analysis, cross-cutting pillars of how the compact should be constructed and implemented and monitored. And you can see the full list of them there, but for our purposes today, we just want to highlight, of course, in the first column, that one of the guiding principles of the Global Compact for Migration is, in fact, gender responsiveness, which is a recognition of many of the factors that we've mentioned earlier about the ways in which migration impacts women and girls uniquely and often in a more disproportionately negative fashion in terms of their ability to continue enjoying their rights while in a situation of migration.
And there are 23 objectives in the Global Compact for Migration, and we don't have time to go over all of them, but I've posted links in the chat to the NGO Committee on Migration's GCM at a Glance document and the full text of the Global Compact if you'd like to look into it yourself. And though all of the objectives are relevant to our topic today, we will focus on those that are most directly related to climate displacement. So under Objective 1, states commit to improving and investing in the collection, analysis, and dissemination of accurate, reliable, and disaggregated data to ensure this data guides coherent and evidence-based policymaking and well-informed public discourse, and allows for effective monitoring and evaluation of the implementation of commitments over time. It specifically references data on the environmental aspects of migration and disaggregation of data by sex and age to understand the situation of girls and women in migration.
The next very important objective for us to highlight is the second, objective number 2, which is to minimize adverse drivers and structural factors that compel migration, meaning forced migration as a necessity rather than a choice. And it's an important, very important factor, of course, when it comes to climate migration, because more ideally than addressing the fallout of climate migration, we would much prefer to mitigate the climate change that's causing it in the first place and save everyone both the work and the suffering that comes as a result. And very importantly, under this objective, there was actually named a special section, a special subset of policy options that were encouraged among the member states in order to specifically address the climate drivers of forced migration.
So next, under Objective 5, states commit to enhance availability and flexibility of rights-based and gender-responsive pathways for regular migration, including by developing policies and practices for admission and stay for migrants who are compelled to leave their countries of origin due to the adverse effects of climate change and environmental degradation, while adaptation in or return to their countries of origin is not possible. And availability of regular pathways for migration is really critical so that girls and women moving for environmental reasons are not forced into dangerous channels that would further increase their vulnerability to violence or trafficking in transit.
Objectives 6, 7, and 10, though very distinct in their own purposes, if you examine closely, we're taking together as important in terms of addressing women and girls' safety while in migration, either in transit or in work situations following, because Objective 6 has to do with ensuring that businesses are employing fair and ethical recruitment practices in recruiting migrant workers to cross borders to be in their employ. Objective 7 has to do with addressing and reducing vulnerabilities, specifically among others, including women and girls on migratory routes. And Objective 10 has to do with preventing and combating and eradicating trafficking in persons, which of course disproportionately affects women and girls.
And finally, under Objective 20, states commit to promote faster, safer, and cheaper transfer of remittances and foster financial inclusion of migrants and their families, including by enabling women in migration to access financial literacy training and formal remittance transfer systems, as well as to open a bank account and own and manage financial assets as a means to reduce gender inequalities and foster active participation in the economy. And these policies must reach not only women who are displaced, but also women who are trapped or left behind in times of crisis, who have become female heads of households when their family members migrate. So we're going to skip over the negotiations of how we got there, but we'll move on to implementation. The GCM really emerged from the needs of the local level and the recognition that a piecemeal approach to migration governance that had existed for decades wasn't working, and that enhanced cooperation and collaboration were necessary to protect the rights and dignity of people on the move. And since its adoption in 2018, the GCM has returned to the national and local levels for the implementation phase, where it's being integrated into national laws and policy strategies and operationalized by all stakeholders to have a positive impact on the lives of migrants and their communities. The UN Network for Migration was established in 2018 to provide coordinated system-wide support to member states in their implementation and follow-up and review of the GCM. It's coordinated by IOM, but it includes members of the UN system who wish to be part of it and for whom migration is part of their mandates, including UN Women and the UNFCCC. And the UN Network for Migration has been working over the past 2 years or so to help governments develop national implementation plans establish a capacity building mechanism, a migration multi-partner trust fund, and a global knowledge platform and connection hub. They've also established thematic working groups, which do include members from civil society. And one of those working groups is on regular pathways for migrants in vulnerable situations. And there was just a meeting this week led by IOM, the UNFCCC, UNHCR, and ILO on creating a new work stream on climate change and migration. And we as civil society have a really critical role to play as service providers in implementing the policy options outlined in the Global Compact, but also in advocating to our governments at the national level to include rights-based and gender-responsive policies to address climate-induced migration into their national action plans for the Global Compact and in follow-up and review of this process. So for that follow-up, the main global platform to discuss and share progress on the implementation of all of the aspects of the Global Compact is a new forum called the International Migration Review Forum. And the IMRF is scheduled to happen at UN headquarters every 4 years, beginning in 2022. It's going to be up to the President of the General Assembly for the next session to pick the dates of the meeting, but we're guessing it's going to happen in May next year. There are also regional reviews, which began last year and which will also happen every 4 years. The IMRF will include 4 interactive multi-stakeholder roundtables, followed by a policy debate and a plenary where governments will make national statements. And governments will be invited to make voluntary reports to review their implementation of the GCM. And we hope that civil society will be consulted as part of that reporting. The modalities resolution of the IMRF, which I will post in the chat in a couple of minutes, reiterates the importance of effective participation of all relevant stakeholders, and it requests that the PGA organize and preside over 1 day of informal, interactive, multi-stakeholder hearings before each forum, and to invite representatives of civil society to present a summary of that meeting during the opening segment of the plenary. The IMRF will be an important space for us as civil society to share the experiences of migrants and communities and contribute to the discussion of progress, challenges, emerging trends, and recommendations regarding migration. Civil society is already beginning to mobilize for the IMRF, including through a webinar series that's going on right now. You all are invited to the session on climate change and migration, which will be happening on the 18th of May. And I will again leave a link with more information in the chat. And my last point is that the IMRF is by no means the only space that we can or should be advocating for rights-based and gender-responsive policies for people displaced by climate impacts and migrants in countries in crisis. It's important that we include climate discussions in migration spaces, but it's also important to include migration discussions in climate spaces. So we need to advocate that governments include climate-induced migration into their national climate adaptation strategies and to ensure that displacement is discussed in spaces like COP26. So with that, I will end. Thank you again so much for inviting us. I hope you all have a wonderful rest of your Earth Day, and we're looking forward to the rest of the discussion.
Thank you so much. And yes, we're celebrating Earth Day today, which is why we are focusing on issues related to restoring our Earth. So happy Earth Day to everyone. And thank you all for being so active in the chat. We will take questions at the end. So if you have questions, we're going to try to note them. Thank you so much for all the greetings. Huri has posted the link to our program today for those who want to take a look, and also for more extensive bio on our presenters. Thank you so much, Cecily and Teresa, for this stellar presentation. We're doing kind of beginning with an overview, and then we'll get into more specifics. Today, it happens that we'll be focusing on issues related to Africa. So thank you for including those examples of Latin America, Central America, and in Asia in your presentation. And also for just to highlight this point that it's civil society's critical role as service providers and providing input into these national action plans. I think that that's one issue that we need to take forth, being such a global audience here. So next, I am going to turn to our next speaker, my colega, Dr. Trisha Callender, as we know her, Trisha. She is a researcher on South Africa. Trisha has 10 plus years of experience leading large scale campaigns and research projects in 10 countries in Asia, Africa, Latin America, the former Soviet Union, and of course the US, for organizations such as the UN, Ford Foundation, and NGOs worldwide. She has lived in South Africa for 5 years, doing research on migration and refugee rights. Originally, she is from Barbados and has completed her dissertation from Columbia University in sociology with distinction, a paper called "Thank You for Not Coming, Policy, Politics, and Polity for Immigrants in South Africa, the Case of Cape Town." So I just want to bring up, make sure that we have Trisha. And the last point I want to say is that Trisha, also a member of the NGO Committee on Migration, Trisha most recently for the NGO Forum planned, executed, guided us in providing anti-racism programming at the forum. And for that, we're very, very grateful. If I can ask everyone to mute, and we'll bring on Trisha. The floor is yours. 10 minutes. Let's please try to keep to this so we can have questions at the very end.
Yes. Can everyone hear me? Just give me a
yes.
Okay, great. I will keep this to 10 minutes because I think the most interesting part of this conversation will really be the question and answer session. So if I may be allowed, I'm going to share my screen. And perfect. All right, so I am going to be speaking to you today for 10 minutes or less. I got that very loud and clear, Rosa, on the intersections of gender, climate, and migration. What will differ, because Cecile and Teresa, thank you for a wonderful presentation and laying the groundwork. So I will make sure to steer clear of repeating a lot of information. But what I will advocate for in this particular presentation is that tripartite intersection of gender, climate, and migration. We need to start looking at that from not only a research perspective, but a policy perspective, or we're going to find ourselves treading water. Because I think this issue, as Cecile and Teresa have so amply pointed out, it affects different women in different ways and different contexts. And so it's important at the front end of this to really insert an intersectional lens and something that is responsive to all of the different factors that influence migration, particularly for women around the world. So with that, I posted here something from 2013. 2013 is the year that I completed that research that Rosa referred to. And it's from a UNDP study on gender and climate change. And it states the following, among other things: the degree to which people are affected by climate change impacts is partly a function of their social status, gender, poverty, power, access to, and control over resources. So we know this now. This is about, oh my goodness, almost 10 years ago. We know this. Here we are now in 2019, and we're still saying the same thing, but we've not looked at those intersectionalities. So UN Secretary General Gutierrez said a little less than 2 years ago, the global threat of climate change and environmental degradation is poised to exacerbate the already increasing numbers of complex emergencies, which disproportionately affect women and girls. There is an urgent need for better analysis and concrete immediate actions to address the linkages between climate change and conflict from a gender perspective. So what is happening, at least as far as I can tell in my research and work, there is gender and migration, there is gender and climate change, and they almost seem like two separate tracks. I am pushing here that we start to consider in our work and in our advocacy to bring those together. Yes, it's messy, but not getting it right is messier. So here's what we already know. Gender exacerbates the already dire implications of climate change. It's no surprise. That's something that Cecile and Teresa amply presented earlier. Gender norms and power dynamics certainly impact how women and men of different backgrounds experience or contribute to insecurity in a changing climate. What is interesting about this bullet, and it's something that I think that we as NGOs, and anyone concerned with gender equality need to do better, is exactly this part here. This is different backgrounds. Not all women are experiencing the effects of climate change the same way. Alongside that, the same for migration. It really requires looking at situations more holistically. The first attempt to do that is the 2019 report, which is where I pulled that quote from before, on the UN report called Gender, Climate, and Security. And this is really focused more on security in terms of physical security from war, but there's other aspects of it as well, and how to maintain peace on the front lines of climate change. There's a direct link between sustainable peace and climate change. We also know that peace processes where women are involved have something like a 35% chance more of sticking for 10 years or more. If women are fleeing these countries, if women are disproportionately affected by climate change, that has implications not just for the receiving country, but the peace of the country that they're leaving. There are all sorts of cards that can fall apart if this is not addressed in a tripartite intersectional fashion. So here are some real life implications. And the reason I added this is because this was something I noticed in my own research in South Africa, but if anyone has done a doctoral dissertation, you know it's very, very narrow. So you see all of these things happening around you. You try to include them to the extent that you can, but if it's not directly related to your research question, then it's something that you kind of put on the side, but you know that you're going to pick it up later. One thing I did observe, and it was not hard data that I had collected, but when I was working in South Africa, I started working initially with IDPs as a result of the xenophobic riots. And it was the worst incidence of violence since the end of apartheid. And so South Africa was kind of grappling with what to do with it. The president at the time was Thabo Mbeki, and he referred to it more as hooliganism, and there were all of these debates happening. But one thing I observed that nobody was really talking about was a lot of the people, most of them were coming from, mainly the ones in Cape Town were coming from Central Africa, but you had people coming in from Sahara, and you had people coming in from West Africa as well. But one thing I noticed was, particularly for Central Africa, was a lot of the people that A, they, yes, were fleeing war, but B, there was some natural or unnatural disaster, some climate disaster, some weather-related disaster that had impacted their ability to feed themselves. And we had not really looked at that carefully, and here we are now, and we're still at the nascent stages of really looking at that. People look at migration, they think either you're fleeing war or you're looking for economic opportunities that are improved. But at that point, and still today, it's not really being pushed as much as it should be. So here are the real life implications for this. There's been more research, thank God, since I completed my research in 2013 about just how this affects women. So for example, I previously mentioned West Africa. In northern Nigeria, norms of masculinity are intensifying intercommunal farm herder conflicts and motivating young men to join armed groups like Boko Haram as climate change impacts destroy natural resource-based livelihoods. And so there's now a link between extremism and climate change, and the impacts of that on women are astronomical, astronomical. They're being kidnapped, they're being abused. We knew this was happening before, but now climate change is exacerbating what was already a really dire situation. Here's another example. In Chad, what is termed in the report as everyday violence against women and girls creates economic stress. And we've seen this with COVID-19 in 2020 and beyond. We're still in a COVID world. GBV has increased exponentially. Economic insecurity makes adolescent girls more vulnerable to early marriage, and young men more vulnerable to being enlisted in armed groups. These are real implications that are not just, oh, it's, we're not able to feed ourselves, or there's a 1 or 2 degree difference, and that recedes the sea levels. All of that is true, but here is what happens when those things take place. And I think those links need to really be made crystal clear in our advocacy. In Sudan, the outmigration of men from villages due to impacts of climate change on traditional pastoral and agricultural-based livelihoods has left women with new economic responsibilities that they're not particularly prepared for, and the implications of that on the social structure are still yet to be determined. And I think we will hear about that later, but that's a real thing, that's a real impact. And in Egypt, rapid population growth, limited freshwater supply makes the country vulnerable to impacts of climate change. So what does that mean for water availability, for food, for energy security, employment, housing, health, you name it? There's a domino effect of implications for not looking at gender and climate properly. I will not beat that to death. And then in looking at gender and migration and climate change, gender plays a vital role in the development of migration policies, and its importance in terms of climate change was even recognized in the 2015 Paris Agreement. So it's there. We're starting to have that discourse. We're starting to have that conversation. But where we are now in reality is still just a conversation. This tripartite has not really been adequately addressed research-wise. It has not been addressed policy-wise. Yes, there's been a bit of a change since 2013, but the people who work on this consistently, women and gender constituency, one of the 9 UNFCCC stakeholder groups, they felt it was still under-recognized. They felt it was still under-considered. So yes, there's been incremental, very small attempts to start to understand this and wrap our hands around it, but we are still way behind, because even though we're taking baby steps, climate change isn't. So I just wanted to provide by the numbers and I have always abhorred this term. I realize that it probably translates differently in different languages, but migrant stock, and that's the official term used by UN DESA, by region and by gender. And what you will notice here is, for the most part, it's pretty even. For Northern America, for Europe, for the regions that are represented here. For the last 20 years, the estimated stock of international migrants grew tremendously by 89% in Asia, whereas the share of female international migrants in Asia grew by 57%. At 63.5% and 48.1% respectively, the labor force participation rate of migrant women was higher than that of migrant men. Yes, I'm sorry, I messed that up. The participation rate of migrant women was higher than that of non-migrant women in 2017. And female migrants, not a surprise here, have lower paying employment, are more likely to be exploited sexually, and experience GBV way more than their male counterparts. But herein lies the rub. We know all of this, but the unpreparedness for the world still persists. Refugees fleeing their native countries due to the effects of the climate crisis in future years may not be forced to return if their lives are in danger. That's great. This is something that happened fairly recently, a ruling in January 2020, and this was the result of a case that took place near New Zealand. I will have to pull the data. I don't want to mispronounce the country. And the person had sued in New Zealand court saying that climate change was the reason that they deserved refugee status. And I believe that was in 2017. And after a very protracted court battle, they ended up losing. But 3 years later, what happens here is that the United Nations Human Rights Committee looks at that case and decides that it's a precedent for their policy. So we're certainly on our way to understanding it. Now, what do we do? 2018 World Bank report predicted that 143 million people from South Asia, Latin America, and Sub-Saharan Africa could be forced to migrate due to climate conditions by 2050, which seems like a faraway time, but it really isn't. So is the world really prepared for 143 million people to migrate? They can barely manage what's happening now. So what is it that our work in gender equality, what is it that we do? In 2020, about 10,000 people have already, and this was in January 2020, which is in parentheses at the end of the sentence, were already attempting to migrate northward after 2 devastating storms hit, and this is in the Americas, and many more were planning to leave soon, according to a Washington Post article that was dated January 2020. It got much, much worse, and most of those migrating were women. And to Cecile and Teresa's earlier point, all of this is in the context of, and we looked at the previous slide, we saw migration for the most part was pretty even. I mean, not exactly, but overall, you know, pretty even. But those displaced by climate change, that's not even. My research, what I pulled, was 78% of those displaced by climate change are women and girls. Meanwhile, most of migration previously was gender balanced. So what are the implications here? What this does tell us is that climate change migration is a gender issue. So next steps. We are talking about gender migration, and there's renewed focus and renewed energy. That's great. We're talking about climate change and gender. There's renewed focus and there's renewed energy. That's great. That absolutely needs to happen. What also needs to happen simultaneously is that there needs to be a linkage between the three. You cannot separate them. And this is my call for the intersectional approach in how we look at policy, how we look at research, because if we don't, we miss all of what I just described. We have a really wonderful team of women that work on this all over the world, a wonderful team of men and those who do not, who are really advocating for the rights of women, including their right to be safe. It is essential to put climate change at the front of that agenda. I urge all of you here that have taken your time, that you could have done anything else. I urge all of you here to, when you start to look at your work for gender equality, for climate change, for migration, to start getting your hands a little bit messy and start getting your brain a little bit messy and think about applying a lens that looks at all three. It's not something that we do well. It's not something that we've really done well. And we're still at the nascent stages of really understanding what intersectionality is in international development in general. So don't feel bad. But if there was a sector that was going to do this well, it would be gender equality. And so NGO CSW, particularly of how it's positioned, can really serve a critical role in doing exactly that kind of advocacy. I think out of all of the organs that exist within the huge UN constellation, the one, at least most recently, that has had the most success galvanizing people, keeping them excited, has been NGO CSW. There's been no question about that. And so to that end, there is some, not just advocacy energy, but advocacy influence and push that the organization has. And I do not see why, and I suggest that, I do not see why not, and I suggest that is something that NGO really, the CSW really take up and look at. One of the pillars of the work that they're doing is to tie all of these together. And then women experience deleterious effects of migration far more violently than their male counterparts, and failure to address that now means that it's gender work later. I ask whoever that is if you would be kind enough to mute, thank you. And I will be wrapping up here with some recommendations. Number one, and I've probably beat this to death, advocating for climate justice in the context of gender and migration. We cannot separate the three. We simply cannot separate the three. And we need to apply a more intensive gender lens in all of the work that is done in migration and climate change research. It's really interesting how women are half the world, but we have to advocate for really the perspective, gender perspective, and all of these international development challenges that disproportionately affect women. This is work that DSW has been doing all along. And I think certainly within our own work, if we're able to attack this intersectionally, we can serve as a model for the rest of the UN and for the rest of the world, NGOs worldwide, and exactly how to do this. Because we're at the nascent stages, we really have an opportunity to set this agenda. And to that end, position, yes?
Oh, sorry, I hate to interrupt you, but I think
I'm finishing up.
I'm just gonna ask you to wrap up.
Yeah, this is the penultimate slide. We are positioning NGOs CSW as a key advocacy organization, in my mind, of the tripartite nexus of climate change, migration, and gender. We need to start commissioning research, and we need to, our grassroots, our hands at the pulse of what's going on, we need to be able to feature those case studies. So I thank you all very much for coming here and hearing these different perspectives, and let's get to work. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And I do apologize, but we are eating up our Q&A time. So with this, let me just invite Jordan, my partner in organizing this, to the next speakers. Jordan, are you there?
Yep, so I will be brief as well. You hear me okay? So I just want to express our immense gratitude to the guests that we have from Western Sahara, who are joining us at great personal risk to themselves. And so one of the unavoidable effects of climate change is the drastic decrease in the availability of natural resources. And tragically, that's made genocide against the Sahrawi people an increasingly profitable endeavor. So there have been war crimes, crimes against humanity, and like I said, just genocidal practices, policies for over half a century at this point. But as of November 13th, 2020, the Moroccan monarchy has actively resumed full-scale war against the displaced people, internally displaced people, and refugees of Western Sahara. So it's not taking up any more time. I will pass the floor over to Maju Mahalia from DESA, which is essentially the human rights monitoring mechanism in the region, because there is not one yet authorized through the Security Council.
Yes, thank you, Jordan. Thank you, everyone. Good morning, good evening, and good afternoon to everyone. Thank you for having us. Indeed, as Ms. Jordan have briefed you on the situation in Western Sahara is dramatically deteriorating because of resumption of war. On the 13th of November 2020, Morocco have breached the ceasefire and annexed extra territories to the south of Western Sahara, which was declared by the Polisario Front, which is the legal representative of the Sahrawi people and the liberation movement, declared as a breach of the ceasefire, a resumption of hostilities in the region and in the territory. Well, that we have another, my colleague have already sent an intervention recorded that you can find back on the YouTube channel that explain a little bit of the background and the history of Western Sahara and the occupation since the Spanish withdrawal, the illegal withdrawal from Western Sahara, and the new occupation that came with the Moroccan occupying forces invading Western Sahara in 1975. Since 1975, the Sahrawi people have been facing crimes against humanity and war crimes, mass graves. Giving examples, we still have a couple of locations to investigate: Lemseyed, mass graves, Jdeiriya, Hagouniya, and Tifariti. Those are areas so far located where mass graves have been detected and found and still need to be investigated in details. We have the situation now in Western Sahara. We are under siege by the Moroccan occupying forces. Military and police are in every corner of the streets. We have women suffering from daily attacks by the Moroccan occupying forces. A case of a woman, a very brave woman that we need to salute, all of us, Sultana Khaya in Bujdur, is now under house arrest for 153 days, struggling every day to go out, but prevented by Moroccan forces. And the only way that she found to express herself is to go on the top of her house, raising the flag of Western Sahara, calling the international community to intervene to provide allow the people of Western Sahara to exercise their right to self-determination, which was promised by the United Nations in 1991, for which MINURSO, which is a UN mission to Western Sahara, was established 30 years later or 31 years later. This referendum that the mission was created for is yet to be organized, and there is no serious advance toward the solution in Western Sahara. Now, since the 13th November, we have noticed as a human rights organization reporting on the human rights situation in Western Sahara, kids have been arrested. At least a dozen of underage young kids have been arrested. Some of them released after 24 or 48 hours. Some of them are sentenced to 6 months to 1 year in jail. We have 45 political prisoners are all taken from Western Sahara and imprisoned inside Morocco, at least 1,000 kilometers far away from their families, not allowed to be visited, and displaced from prison to prison every 5 weeks to 3 months, which make it very difficult to follow up on their situation. Some of them were on hunger strike, demanding the basic rights as prisoners. We have the discrimination in Western Sahara. As you may know, Western Sahara was invaded in 75, and then Morocco have floated hundreds of thousands of settlers into the territory, and hundreds of thousands of military personnel. So we are a minority in our country, where we actually find it very difficult to access to our natural resources, for instance, which was all dealt with or given to the Moroccan settlers as to encourage them to stay in the territory. And in some cases, unfortunately, funded by international institutions like the EU, for instance, that is funding building housing compounds for fishermen coming from Morocco. It's an illegal crime committed by the EU, which is considered as a respecting the human rights and defending the human rights. Hospitals, we don't have real hospitals. We can call it the first aid centers, and those are basically run and managed by Moroccan doctors, and it seems they are very well trained on being occupiers and very well trained on discriminating the Sahrawis. The normal healthcare access is very difficult, and especially for those who have been injured in peaceful protests or have been in clashes with the Moroccan armies or Moroccan police. Those are not allowed to have any medical treatment in Western Sahara, and we really find it very difficult to treat those cases. This in general, the situation, I mean, it's a very rich country from one hand and a very poor people. Our people is divided in two separate parts. One part living in the refugee camps in South Algeria, depending on humanitarian aid, and the other part is living under occupation. Those in the camps are very poor. Those on the occupied territories, majority is poor. There is a percentage that have access to some of the resources, but that is always against allegiance to the occupier. So it's an forced allegiance, which is a crime according to international humanitarian law. All this happened in 45, 46 years of occupation in Western Sahara, and there is no international observation, no international monitoring, no international protection for the Sahrawi civilians in Western Sahara. even the International Red Cross Committee, the International Committee of the Red Cross is not present in the occupied territories of Western Sahara. The MINURSO, which is the UN mission to Western Sahara, is the only mission in the world that has no mandate to monitor human rights. The situation is really politically, from the political side, it's linked to migration, as a couple of the speakers have mentioned before, and linked to terrorism. They claim that Western Sahara is close to Sahel region, close to Mali, to Mauritania, and would be open area to the Sahara area or the Sahel, and that Morocco can be a kind of guarantee of security. But from the other hand, the Sahel region is quite far. There is Algeria and Mauritania between Western Sahara and the Sahel region. That's geographically speaking. And from the other hand, the Sahrawi people is considered is an Arab language, Arabic people, Muslim. But if I can compare with the Arab world and Western Sahara, I think we are the most open society, where also women have a special prestigious position within the society. Woman is the one who built everything we have, while when we had war against Morocco and Mauritania and Spain before, only women were building the houses, were building the schools, were managing the hospitals, were doing running the system, running the organization, organizing the people and everything. But going back to the Sahel region, the stability, we think that this has nothing to do with Western Sahara from one hand, and the second, if we can speak on terrorism, we see only Moroccan terrorists exported to other parts of the world. So maybe the role that Morocco can play on that is to control its own terrorists. Migration, Western Sahara have been now since 15 years a crossing route from Africa and sub-Saharan Africa to Europe. Of course, to reach out to Morocco, there is a lot of illegal trading in people, run by Moroccan army, run by Moroccan organizations that bring people from the sub-Saharan African countries and transport them up to Spain and to France and to Italy. Western Sahara, with its limited people, we are not even 1 million if we count everyone. So, and with a large territory, with a huge natural resources, we can be a part of the solution of those kind of issues. We can absorb a lot of immigration into Western Sahara in the future. So I will not take long from your time. There is also another intervention that have been sent recorded. You can always get back to it. And whenever you have any questions related to Western Sahara, please do not hesitate to contact us. We'll be happy to work with every one of you. And if needed, we can always support you if we can. Thank you very much for this opportunity. I appreciate it.
Thank you. And so we do have a video intervention that we'll upload to the YouTube just for the sake of time, so that we can also hear from Naza El-Qaidi. She's a female human rights defender and a journalist at Keep Media. She has been arrested, jailed, tortured, brutally attacked on multiple occasions. So I'm using my voice a bit for speaking out about the genocidal practices going on in Western Sahara. Even just like monitoring the news feeds from the last week or two, there were several other reporters whose homes were broken into, and they've been, we assume they're being jailed and tortured. Nobody knows where they are, but that's even just within this week. So we're very grateful to have the representatives from DESA, but also to have Naza here with us to share her experiences.
Jordan, can I ask that we only have 10 more minutes, that it'd be 5 minutes, and then we have 5 minutes for Beth?
we can.
If we can, I do apologize.
Yes. Excuse me, we also have Jillian Mantilla. So we are really short on time.
And
Our
Jillian.
meeting goes to 10:30.
Okay.
We can leave it
Okay.
open. It should.
Okay.
Hello, everyone.
And then we have Q&A. Okay, so I think we can probably have enough time.
We'll just leave the Zoom open.
Okay, hello?
Please go ahead.
Do you hear me? Okay. Thank you so much for all these fruitful presentations. Thank you so much, Jordan, for reaching me out. So I will just add more like a few informations on what my colleague Meleha just said. Just to talk about like Western Sahara, and just to give you some general information, Western Sahara is classified as one of the longest political and humanitarian conflicts in the world. Western Sahara is a vast region located in northwestern Africa, with an area of about 266,000 square kilometers, bordered by Algeria to the east and Mauritania to the south, Morocco to the north, and to the Atlantic Ocean to the west. Morocco controls about 80% of the land after invaded the territory in the 1975. Polisario is controlling the rest and managing the rest of the territory. And regarding the United Nations, Polisario is identified as the only representative of the Sahrawi people. So it was a war for over for 16 years, from the 75 until 1991. After Polisario Front and Morocco decided to sign a ceasefire. And from that time until the 13th of November last year, where the war also restarted again after Morocco violated the ceasefire after targeting peaceful protests who were protesting against a gap which is built by the Moroccan occupation in the wall that divided our country. And this is another humanitarian crimes that that is committed to the Moroccan occupation against the Sahrawi human beings. There is a wall which long as 2,700 kilometers, and that it has more than 10 million landmines that threat the life of the Sahrawi and divide the territory and also the people. So it was a gap that's used by the Moroccan occupation illegally to transport the natural resources to the Africa from Western Sahara. Just to remind you, Western Sahara is one of the richest country in the world regarding the natural resources. And the people doesn't benefit from these natural resources. Half of the population of Western Sahara are living in exile in Algeria desert, where the temperature is to 60 degrees, and where the condition of life is really, really tough for the Sahrawi there, and the people there are living under humanitarian aid. They were there displaced by force there after Morocco invaded their territory and bombarded them with phosphor and just targeted the people, and they were flee to look for safe places, and Algeria accepted them as refugees, where they built the refugees now there, and where they also established the Sahrawi states. So I'm a human rights defender from the occupied territory. I'm a member with a group of media activists called Equipe Media. The life here is really difficult. So Morocco is imposing a totally media and military blockade that prevent the people from expressing themselves, and that's also using a way which is repression and tortured people, beating them, taking them to the prison just to show down all the vices that's against the Moroccan occupation. So life is difficult not only for the Sahrawi women, but for all the Sahrawi people, since we don't have freedom, no dignity, no space to speak up, and no rights. But the woman's life is more difficult, because she's enduring more than her capacity. So the woman, the Sahrawi woman, is victim of torture and beaten from the beginning of the invasions, from the beginning, for all the years of the occupation that's going on their territory till this woman. Till this moment, sorry, the woman is victim of the insult, and we know how Moroccan regime is a patriarchal and misogynist that harassed every woman, even the Moroccan women inside Morocco. And you can imagine how it is for the Sahrawi women that is already hated by the Moroccan state because she belongs to the Sahrawi people. So she's victim of media defamations by the Moroccan service intelligence that ruin her reputation. And it's a way actually that is used by the Moroccan occupation to stop the female activists from their activism. And actually I was victim of this after being arrested in 2018, and the police has stolen my phone, started publishing badly about me, publishing my personal pictures, writing articles, and just spread fake informations about me to ruin my reputation and to target my work, since the women, unfortunately, is really weak in the societies that is very conservative, such as the Sahrawi society. Of course, the woman has sacrificed a lot, and she's the more visible face in the resistance, but still she's the first victim of the society pressure and of the occupation oppression. I will go also to the one of the policies that Morocco is using to marginalize the Sahrawi human beings, which is like a bad education system in the ground. It's hard for us as a Sahrawi young to study because we don't have universities in the occupied territory of Western Sahara. And if we want to finish our study, we have to travel to a foreign country, which is Morocco, where we also face other phase of discrimination and repression inside Morocco by the people who are victims of the Moroccan police propaganda against Sahrawis, and also by the administrations of the universities and by the police there. So Western Sahara we don't have like any universities, any centers that's from them we can get like a very good education or high education that help us to develop our skills. Sahrawi woman doesn't have opportunities to satisfy her dreams. You can imagine that the basic needs of life are dreams for us. We cannot get a job, and we are not allowed to choose our own future by ourselves. And it's difficult, if we want, as I said, for the women to travel, not all the Sahrawi families are allowed their daughters to travel to Morocco to study because they are afraid to put their daughters at risk in the state of the enemy, since we considered Morocco as an enemy, because they considered us as an enemy, they threat us as an enemy. So Sahrawi women in the occupied territories is spending her life at home, unfortunately taking care of husbands, kids, parents, no change in her life, and no voice for her, and no safe places for her, no safe places for her to express herself, and to if she wants to protest, of course the jail will be her determination. So Sahrawi woman is in the front because she's the first victim of the Moroccan brutality, and she's the brave one in the Sahrawi struggle and in the Sahrawi resistance, and she continues her struggle because she believes in this fair case. And of course we call all over the world to support her and support the Sahrawi people to reach their goal, which is a simple goal: freedom, dignity, and independence. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for sharing your experiences, and again for your bravery and being willing to be recorded and for us to distribute this information so everyone can hear about what's going on. Just in 30 seconds to kind of reiterate the ties into climate change. As they mentioned, over the last 15 years, the migration routes for all of Africa have gradually been shifting from Libya across into Italy to through Western Sahara, which is actually one of the most heavily landmine-filled areas in the world. They're mostly anti-take landmines, not anti-personnel. There's about 9 million of them total, 7 million within Sahara, then also through Algeria, Mauritania at the south, and a bit of southern Morocco as well. So as climate change continues to evolve, the situation deteriorates. Many of the points that Trisha had made earlier, all of that is now going to have to start passing through this war zone that has escalated. And also, as Maju mentioned, there's probably one of the richest in terms of the square footage and the density of resources. Western Sahara has probably about 40% of the global supply of phosphates that are going to be needed for modern agriculture. As the climate continues to change, there's rich fishing waters, endangered corals. That's why this war is being fought right now. It's just climate change, things are running out. But it's also because of the population density, a great opportunity for investment, for development, and for African migrants to be able to have work and not have to put themselves in danger to cross the seas to go to Europe. But we need peace in the territory first. So I'll stop talking now and transfer the presentation back over to Rosa. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jordan. And thank you, Naza and Om, for this impassioned presentations. We've gone from looking at the global and getting an overview to more specific analysis from Trisha, and now to these real life presentations and narratives, which really ground us in the reality. And thank you for also bringing in this aspect, the connection with the link to migration and terrorism. And of course, speaking from the heart about the gender implications of your situation. So thank you very much. And I do apologize, I misspoke. We want to leave plenty of time for questions at the very end. So we have 2 presentations. The next one flows from this. We're going to be hearing about work in Europe with migrants. So we have Jillian Montilla, who is with the European Network for Migrant Women. She is currently at the European Network for Migrant Women finalizing a project aimed at enhancing the political participation of young migrant and refugee women. Jillian is the 2020 FWMAP UN Women Youth Poet and a dedicated anti-racist feminist activist. She's currently pursuing her Master's of Human Rights at Sciences, Political Sciences, where she is a project consultant with their gender research program. So we're very happy to have Jillian. Jillian, if you can turn on your camera and come in. So we have 10 minutes for you.
Hi, thank you so much for that warm welcome. Just give me 1 second as I share my screen.
Are you labeled as Sylvia Rose here?
No, as a Jillian Montilla.
Okay. All right, perfect.
So, hi everybody. I want to.
If you can turn on your video.
Oh, my video is on. Thank you, Pamela, for the invitation to address the committee today. I am admittedly much greater in my experience in the field of migration, but what I hope to share with you today is what I've learned since beginning consulting on an action research project with the European Network of Migrant Women last fall. It aimed at identifying, defining, and analyzing the major barriers and gaps impeding migrants and refugee women's participation in international decision-making processes, with a specific focus on young women ages 16 to 25 years old, and coming up with recommendations and methodology on how to bridge them. With the intensification of climate change and the continued feminization of patterns of migration, we as practitioners and NGOs have the responsibility to be prepared and to know how to create the spaces and opportunities for young migrant women to come forward, to be decision makers, to learn to be leaders within their own associations. It has been a fascinating project, not only in the process of expanding my own understanding of political participation beyond conventional electoral rights, such as voting or standing for election, but also in finding myself in the research. Through interviews with researchers and practitioners, I learned that you can be second, third generation born in these European countries and still be considered migrants. I understand that in countries like France, for example, where the gathering of ethno-racial data is still taboo, studying migrant status to the second or third degree is often employed as a proxy for race. But I do think it is a testament to how pervasive and persistent the process of othering really is. As a first generation Filipino American, I hesitate to appropriate the label, but I found that I had more in common than I expected with the young migrant women that I met through the project, especially in terms of grappling with the after effects of gender-based violence born out of racist stereotypes, but also in finding solidarity and figuring out what it means to be a young woman in spaces that have not been built for you, that have not been historically and increasingly so today, not welcoming to you. So, as a poet, I've always known that there was something indescribably powerful about art in connecting us in a way that statistics could never. But it was through this project, which centered the arts, as well as the frustration I experienced with my own anti-racism advocacy work at my university, that I began to understand what Black feminist poet Audre Lorde meant when she said poetry is not a luxury. Feeling empowered, considering oneself and one's lived experience as legitimate, after all, is the first step in political participation. Migrant women are here and they have things to say. However, the failure to include their voices in the political agenda in a meaningful way leads to the overlooking of the subjects that concern them the most. This is why they need to be able to become active political citizens, take part in and really influence international decision-making processes. Without such participation, especially from the grassroots level, political processes risk becoming even more and more detached from the reality of women's lives. Furthermore, through their experiences of intersecting discriminations, migrant and refugee women could bring to the table a cross-cutting and holistic view of systemic change that is sorely needed, especially in regards to climate change. So our funders, Women Forward International, partners academic teams of schools like Sciences Po, where I'm at here in Paris, with the private sector to arrive at a more holistic and humane approach to addressing some of the largest global challenges we're facing, all while centering the reflective power of art in furthering social justice causes. We partnered with the European Network of Migrant Women, which is the only migrant women-led feminist platform advocating for the rights, freedom, and dignity of migrant women and girls in Europe. Our findings emphasize grassroots associations, especially now in COVID, as some of the most relevant and accessible entry points to political participation for young migrant women. I think Radical Girls, the youth movement of the European network, demonstrates this beautifully. The Radical Girls organization are themselves young migrant women who actively participate within the European network's direction and beyond at high-level international events organized by European institutions. We partnered with Radical Girls in some capacity or another on this project's 3 deliverables, in writing a report of the main obstacles to political participation faced by young migrant women that will be published with UNITAR in mid-May. Second, in designing and conducting a capacity building workshop centered around CEDAW, the Convention on Elimination of Discrimination Against Women, and in compiling a toolkit of facilitation techniques aimed at locating and promoting the voices of young migrant women within NGOs. So I'm going to summarize the slide a bit just because it's been reiterated in one form or another, but through our research, interviewing practitioners in Europe, NGOs, researchers, on and on, we identified 4 principal lenses of analysis employed to identify the main obstacles of young migrant women's political participation. So viewing young migrant women for their precarity. Second, young migrant women as victims of sending states and male peers Third, young migrant women as security threats. And finally, viewing young migrant women as independent agents. The first two especially bear the threats of the risk of the essentialization of young migrant women as vulnerable, which not only undermines their agency, bearing considerable weight on their legitimacy in the public forum, but also contributes to the failure of recognizing and then dismantling the wider systemic discriminations that gives rise to their precarity. They also widely lack young migrant women's input on how they're framed in the public forum. The second deliverable is an online workshop that we conducted around CEDAW. A couple of weeks ago, we designed and conducted a workshop with Radical Girls aimed at closing the gap between young migrant women and their rights enumerated in CEDAW. It was an absolutely beautiful 3 hours. And so amidst the COVID pandemic, we managed to connect with 23 amazing young migrant and refugee women from Brazil, the Philippines, the Caucasus, and more, all settled through Europe. We centered their voices in a number of ways, but one of the most salient examples of this was in the workshop's design. Instead of guessing what skills and what aspects of CEDAW would be the most relevant to the participants, we just asked them. So in the weeks leading up to the workshops, we sent them a survey in order to gauge their interests. From there, we designed capacity building breakout sessions around those skills. We ended up designing 3 skills-based sessions, one on public speaking, one on online campaigning, and finally one on mobilizing arts for activism in order to deepen engagement with what they chose was Article 5 of CEDAW, sex roles and stereotyping. And if you look on the picture to the left, I taught the room on arts and activism, and you can see our team performing together a spoken word poem we wrote during our breakout session called Mirror, Mirror. And the first stanza goes, "When you look at me, what you see is a mirror of you, not me. Fantasies created smoke screens obscuring reality. What you see is a mirror of you, not me. Your fears, dreams, and insecurities." So on the right, to cap off the evening and to round up our emotions, I guided the women through meditation and some seated yoga. The workshop was a beautiful example of the opportunity to build networks and safe spaces virtually, but also emphasize the power of centering community, creativity, and interdependence as alternatives to the more prevalent examples of seizing power. So I'm going to wrap up now, but we've pretty much compiled these facilitation techniques, best practices, along with entry points for NGOs to understand and access CEDAW, both upwards at the international level and closer to home at the grassroots level, in a toolkit that we'll be launching on June 17th. If you would like to register, you can take your smartphone out and take a picture of the QR code. I am also going to share the link in the conversation if you would like to just register that way. But yeah, I think that's it for me now. I relinquish my time to the chair. Thank you very much for inviting me.
Fabulous. Thank you so much, Jillian. Not only for your analysis and the perspective you bring of the young women and girls, 16 through 25, but also for your contribution as a poet and just bringing that different dimension. Congratulations on your award with FW MAP 2020 poetry. Thank you so much. So we will move on to a 5 to 7 minute presentation by Beth Blissman, who is going to be reporting on a special effort. Beth is a dear colleague and friend of mine. She is the UN representative of the Loreto community at the UN. She's also a practitioner, scholar in higher education, and brings over 25 years of experience in community engaged teaching and learning to her UN work, as well as her deep interest in permaculture, spirituality, and the fine art of worldview shifting. Beth is a former director of the Bonner Center for Service and Learning at Oberlin College and at University of Denver's Service Learning Program. So she is multifaceted, brings a lot of experience. So Beth, please, you have the floor. And after Beth, we will take questions.
Thank you so much, Rosa. Can folks hear me okay?
Yes.
Excellent. Thank you. Thank you so much, Rosa. It's great to be here. And thanks to Pamela for the invitation. And thank you as well to Jordan and all of the fabulous panelists on today's session. Wouldn't it be fabulous to have a free online searchable website where we could be storing, categorizing, and organizing all of these great presentations? Well, fortunately, now we have that resource. It's called the Women's Human Rights Teaching, Learning, and Advocacy Resource, or WITLAR, or WIRTLAR if you want to get that human rights in there. So this resource is a place where you can learn more about issues affecting women and girls worldwide, and it gives you advocacy and action steps you can take to work towards justice. So here's the brief story. Just under a year ago, a group of over 50 volunteers from civil society, from the grassroots to tenured professors in higher education, were inspired by Soon Young and members of the Feminist and Women's Movement Action Plan, or FWMAP, to come together to prepare something. We weren't sure what. Would it be a curriculum? Would it be a compendium? Would it be something that could be presented? It turned out to be all of these. We created this resource to support the Commission on the Status of Women, the 65th session and beyond, and the Beijing Plus 25 process leading towards the current generation equality forum. So this is the result. It's a free online user-friendly resource for educators, activists, and anyone who wants to learn more. And it is comprised of an introduction module about the UN itself, and then 6 different learning modules organized around 6 different themes dealing with the most pressing challenges to women's human rights today. And Devin, maybe if you could scroll down to show those 6 different areas, that would be helpful. Here we have them in the middle there where it says modules. So each of the 42 teaching modules within those 6 general areas provides resources, guidance, and activities for educators, as well as informal learning communities. I could talk about this for a long time, but I'm going to keep it brief so we have plenty of time for Q&A, because there will be more events in the coming months to officially introduce this resource to you. This is just a taster. Although I do have to do a shout out to Erica Higbee, who you saw earlier in today's program, because she was not only helping lead the nomination committee for NGO CSW, she was the chief herder of cats as she organized each of the 6 of us who are in charge of a module. And then we each had our own group of volunteers that were creating different subtopics within each module. And I will put the link to this website, of course, in the chat. Please do begin to explore it, because it's also a living resource. We need and welcome additions from all parts of the world to help this resource live and grow and become even more helpful to people all over the world. And we look forward to collaborating with each of you to do that. So I will wrap up for today, and happy to have a brief moment to introduce this resource to you. It will become a living resource that hopefully we can all use and contribute to. Oh, and thank you, Pamela, for putting the link into the chat. Have a wonderful Earth Day, everyone, and thanks for all the work that you do. Take care.
Thank you, Beth. I'm so happy to share Earth Day with you, because you're such a strong advocate of restoring Mother Earth. So thank you so much. And this information is fabulous, and it fits so well into this presentation, because as we had practitioners, we had advocates, we had the realities of living and being on the ground. All of these contributors can provide input into this WITLAR, Women's Human Rights Teaching and Learning Advocacy Resource. It's really precisely what, as you mentioned, we've been needing. So thank you so much for this. And thank you for restoring a little bit of our deficit, running out of time here. So we've actually are back on track for 15 or so more minutes of 10 minutes or so, sorry, of some questions. So I want to turn it over to my colleague Pamela, who will do the Q&A session.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for being here with us. And I am so excited about everyone who presented today. Thank you all for taking the time to be, for being here with us. And we're going to start the Q&A with a question from Koka Karishma. And her question is, what is being done to develop the mind, intellect, and fellowship between genders so that choices can be based on good wisdom of the families and teams for the good of all and the earth? And I'm going to see which of our panelists would want to take a stab at answering. Jillian, would you want to?
I'm sorry, the line broke up for a moment. Would you be able to repeat that?
I'm sorry. I was reading your body language and I thought that you were affirming. Okay, what is being done to develop the mind, intellect, and fellowship between genders so that choices can be made based on good wisdom of the families and teams for the good of all and the earth? And anyone can jump in, Cicely, Beth, if you want to take a stand. How are we going to make this inclusive? How are we going to have families involved? And how are we going to consider what's good for Mother Earth? And how can we be fair to Mother Earth? Okay, let's put that one in the bank and let's move on to another question. And we'll come back to that one before we end. And the next question is from Florence Kamanzi. Why will the IMRF only happen every 4 years at the UN headquarters as opposed to more frequently?
So I can take that one.
Excellent.
So we definitely advocated for more frequent review of the Global Compact for Migration, which includes a lot of commitments. So having 193 countries review progress on the implementation of 23 commitments over the past 4 years is a really big ask. And we know from processes like the HLPF that getting countries to review such a comprehensive and interconnected framework leads to very superficial national reviews. But besides the IMRF, there are two main spaces for review, one of which I mentioned very briefly, the regional reviews, which alternate with the global review. So really there's supposed to be two formal reviews, formal reviews every 2 years. The regional reviews were supposed to happen in 2020, and then the IMRF in 2022, and then regional reviews in 2024, and so on. But the first set of regional reviews was delayed due to the pandemic. So they started last year, but actually the Latin American Caribbean regional review is happening next week, and the African review will happen in June. And both of these, actually all of the regional reviews, have had multi-stakeholder hearings attached to them. And the other space that's mentioned for review in the text of the GCM is the Global Forum for Migration and Development, which is an annual event. And the GCM acknowledges that the GFMD is a platform for exchange of experiences on the implementation of the GCM to share good practices and policies and cooperation, to promote innovative approaches, and to foster multi-stakeholder partnership across specific policy issues, including climate displacement. The GCM invites the GFMD to provide that annual space for informal exchange on the implementation of the GCM and to report findings and best practices to the International Migration Review Forum. And the GFMD is much more open to the participation, leadership, and self-organizing power of civil society than most state-led international processes. So it's an important annual space for us to analyze and discuss those sensitive issues and create consensus and share policy and practices. Hopefully that answers the question.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Cicely. The next question is from Wayne Shields, and it is, what is the process for submitting content to this new resource? And I see that Beth has put something in the chat, but Beth, could you articulate just for the people who are not checking the chat?
Sure. Thank you, Pamela. And thanks to you and to Ellen and to Devin and to all the people who are on our team around environmental conservation and rehabilitation, one of the 6 modules. It's an all volunteer effort. And so if you go to the website that's been posted now a few times in chat, and if you just Google Women's Human Rights Teaching, Learning, and Advocacy Resource, it'll come right up. It's on a WordPress platform. And if you scroll down to the bottom of the website, there is an email address where you can submit additions, suggested changes, corrections. It's truly a living document. So we are still in there. We are improving things. This thing does and will have a life of its own, which is fabulous. So please, we're especially in search of voices from the Global South, of course, and lots of case studies. The more case studies, the better. And so there have been some excellent things presented today, and we look forward to adding things. I also wanted to lift up Marta's presence here from El Salvador, Marta Benavides. Thank you so much for your words. And she actually has a very appropriate comment that much of what needs to change in terms of bringing about climate justice is kind of the dream of the North, our American dream, which is often intertwined with overconsumption. So happening right now today, our president is leading a forum of global leaders. You can find that on the US State Department website. But I also want to lift up the resources at the Pachamama Alliance, a wonderful nonprofit out of California that helps us folks from the global North do some great self-reflection and worldview shifting around how we've been raised and how we think. So thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Beth. And I think we have time for one last question from Mandy Marshall. Have any of the presenters noticed whether faith hinders or helps the intersectionality of gender, migration, and climate? Would anyone be comfortable taking a stab at this one?
I would love to take this one. I was actually thinking of answering in this vein for the first question. So it's kind of a perfect meeting place. Given my particular experience with UN-based advocacy has been working with women's faith-based groups, I find that faith and spirituality are kind of a deep wellspring of inspiration and a wonderful starting place for conversations about gender, about migration, about environment. I think because on a practical and spiritual level, there is a very readily available connection between the way we as society approach women and girls and the way we as a society approach our natural environment. There are a lot of correlations between the attitudes of domination and colonization that we've seen used against both women and the natural world historically. And we've also seen harms within faith communities that have been leveraged against the natural world and against women and girls. And so I think for multiple reasons, it's very important conversation to be having from a faith and spiritual perspective and faith communities. And also, of course, to recognize that one of some of our best educators when it comes to responding to climate crisis and learning to adopt a position of respect for sacredness of earth comes from the spiritual traditions of indigenous peoples. And those are in fact spiritual traditions. And it is the depth of spirit and the spiritual approach that is the starting point for the indigenous approach to the environment. And I think it's important to remember that and keep that central and see where it can intersect with every other faith, because there is an entry point for every faith tradition in the world to find some deep inspiration and long-standing passion, because it is slow work to sustain what the kind of long commitment that we need to respond to this multifaceted crisis.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. And I think Tricia wants to weigh in on this also.
Yeah, I just want to weigh in briefly. I won't take a lot of time. I do think that the faith-based communities are really, they can be either sanctuaries, or they can be places where a lot of oppression takes place, but that in and of itself, it's a reflection of the society. It's either the best or the worst of society, but it's somewhere on the continuum. So I would ask that we also, when we talk about faith-based communities, not look at them as they are isolated from all of these factors that influence reasons why women are oppressed, and particular women are oppressed in a particular way, but looking at it more holistically as a part of a larger production function and a whole, where there's different points of entry depending on the context, which is again what calls for the intersectionality work, to really unpack what the faith-based society looks like in that particular context, and if it would be a help or a hindrance. And to that end, one thing that all societal structures have in common in order to push forward an agenda or change minds and hearts, or more importantly, change policies, there is a carrot and a stick. Either it's inclusion, alienation. There's a reason why people want to join, or a reason why people don't want to join something. And so depending on what that structure's reward system is, that I think is more important than the structure itself.
Thank you so much, Tricia, for ending our panel discussions, Q&A, on that positive note. And at this time, I'm going to ask our fearless leader, Huri Galukian, if she would give us our parting words.
Thank you all. What an honor to be around activists like you all and my team. I can't thank you enough. Obviously, we're over by 1 minute. So I'm just going to quickly say, keep your eyes open to our MailChimps that Devin sends out so beautifully with so much information. Thank you all for your support of NGO-CSW. This is only the beginning. We are building momentum, and let's see how we can make this world a better place for all of us. Human rights for all. Thank you. Have a great day.